Perfect. Thank you. Right. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 GigaNet Online Annual Symposium, which follows on from the 2024 GigaNet Symposium that took place in Riyadh. And is the opportunity for many of our speakers who weren't able to come to Riyadh to actually participate in the GigaNet Symposium. My name is Jamal Shaheen. I'm the not sure. I'm the interim program. I'm the program chair for the 2024 GigaNet Annual Symposium, and therefore I've taken on this responsibility to make sure that we are able to run the 2024 annual symposium. But it's my pleasure and honor to pass over the floor to Sophie Hoogenboom, who is the new program chair for GigaNet, and who will act as the chair for the session that we have today. Before I hand over the floor, I'd like to say that we have two panels organized for today, which will be on this same stream. So we'll be using this same Zoom link for these two meetings. And on Thursday, today we are Tuesday, the 18th of February. On Thursday, the 20th of February, we have a second set of two panels that will be organized at a different time zone to fit with our local community of researchers, therefore enabling more people to join in with some of the work that we're doing. So thank you very much to everybody who's here. I will now finally pass the floor on to Sophie, who will introduce the discussant and our panelists. Thanks, Sophie. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for your introduction, Jamal. So, as Jamal mentioned, I am the new chair of the program committee. For those who don't know me, I'm a PhD student at the Free University in Brussels, and I work for the United Nations University in Bruges. And I focus on digital sovereignty, which will also is also the topic of the first paper that we will discuss. So the first panel will have 1.5 hours, so until 3 o'clock Central European time. Each speaker gets 15 minutes because we unfortunately have one person who's sick today. So we'll have each presentation will be 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for our discussant. Our discussant is Serhat. Tutkal, I would ask you to introduce yourself before you give your feedback and your thoughts. But I would first like to give the floor to Grace, who will give the first presentation about a comparative study of China and EU's digital sovereignty. And Grace, if you would like to first introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hello, thank you. How could I share my PPT?
So normally you have the share, but I've made you a co-host.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Jamal.
I mean, there's a big green button at the bottom of your screen, which says it's an arrow pointing upwards that says share underneath it. Whilst we're waiting for the mail to come in.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I just I'm sending the email to you, but the internet is so slow. Okay, I've sent it.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's wait.
Thank you. Okay, I'm a PhD candidate in FU Berlin. And also I'm working as a research assistant in Salena University. And my topic today is about China and EU's digital sovereignty comparison. And my approach is to compare their discourses. So I will use a natural language processing approach to do this.
Okay. Thank you very much for your introduction. Jamal, did you have it? Perfect.
One sec. Let me find.
Have you shared the screen?
I'm just finding
the right. 1 second.
Okay. The my research question is how the discourses are different or differ between the two, and research background is quite simple because sovereignty in subspace is always a controversial issue. But recently, in recent years, the EU has also adopted the digital sovereignty discourse. And before that, China has been doing this for almost 10 years. And I'm curious, why does it happen and how they are different from of their discourses in this digital sovereignty, and why sovereignty in subspace or in internet governance is so controversial, because of there are some dominant discourses in subspace government. The first one is cyber exceptionism, because subspace is not, there is no territory in subspace, and the second is multi-stakeholderism. That means government or states should not play a dominant role in the subspace governance. It should allow other, like private sectors or other sectors, to play an equal role. And the third predominant discourse is global commerce. That means subspace should be a global commerce sphere, so should not be like governed by different countries or within their countries in their own domains. But recently, next slide, please. China and the EU has adopted a lot of digital sovereignty policies. China has been doing this for a long time. Since its connection to the internet in 1994, it has installed the Golden Shield project, the so-called Great Firewall, since then, to filter information, and in 2010 has declared the relation between the state and the sovereignty, and saying that subspace is within the sovereign of its own national border. And after Snowden revelation in 2013, China has initiated a lot of policies and also events to promote the idea of sovereignty. And on the other hand, the EU, especially after 2013, the Snowden revelation, has issued a lot of strategies and policies about the digital governance, and also its own approach of digital sovereignties. Next slide. And my methodology is to use the official discourses from the two regions to compare how they are different, how they converge or diverge from the discourses. And my data sources from China's side is from the official governments, like Subspace Administration of China, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of National Defense, Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, World Internet Conference. Those are the most relevant departments of China related to the internet policy making, and altogether there are 116 pieces get from their websites. And the keywords I used included sub-sovereignty. Actually, most other sovereignty-related terms in the subspace, and also in the EU side, I chose European Commission and the European Council websites to get the digital sovereignty, technological sovereignty, and data sovereignty related texts, altogether 244 pieces, and the time frames until 2024 and December 2031. And the result is next slide. The next slide, please. The first one is the temporal analysis. We can see that in China's side, the last slide. In China's side, the sovereignty discourse emerged since 2012, and the next last slide, please. Yes, thank you. In the Chinese discourse, the sovereignty discourse emerged since 2012, and in the EU side is since 2018, and China's side is like getting faster and emerged faster since 2016, and getting to the peak in 2023. And in the EU side, it emerged very fast since 2018, and it peaked in 2022. And I think after that, it's because of like Corona, because of different global events, it has sank to some extent. And another trend is other discourses related to sovereignty has in a increasing trend. Next slide, please. And to get the ideas of their framing strategies of digital sovereignty, I did a word embedding analysis for both the distance between sovereignty and other terms could indicate which terms are related to sovereignty most. In the China side, the closest one are network, security, state, control, policy, data development, and economy. In the EU side, the one most close to sovereignty is autonomy, security, development, economy. Yeah, and so we can see that they are very different. In the Chinese side are more related to state and control. In the EU side, it's more related to autonomy or policy or development or economy. Next slide, please. And another analysis is the conceptual and association of sovereignty in each year. So each year I got the 10 most relevant terms related to sovereignty, and we can see that all the most relevant terms they got an increased trend. And in China side, the most prominent ones include, for example, China, Xi Jinping, subspace, network security, and digital infrastructure, United Nations. Next slide, please. And in the EU's conceptual associations, the most prominent terms related to EU's digital sovereignties are in like technology, regulation, security, innovation, something like that. And you can see it in the left side, in the right side hand picture. Okay, next slide, please. And the sentiment analysis of the digital sovereignty discourse from both sides are very different. In the Chinese one is the yellow one. It's much negative than the orange one, the EU one. The sentiment is this is about the sovereignty related terms sentiment. So in general, from 2012 to 2024, the Chinese discourse are much more negative than the EU discourses on sovereignty. And next slide, please. And another sentiment analysis is across the whole text of the Chinese and the EU's digital sovereignty, and it covers other topics. It's not only just the digital sovereignty, so we can still see that the EU sides, the left one is Chinese sides. The Chinese sides are much negative than the EU sides, because the Chinese sides are less than 0.0, and the EU sides are at least positive. Okay, next one, please. And then I did a topic modeling of the whole text of the two coupler and find 5 topics for each, and we can see that the different keywords in the two corpus from China and the EU, and the first one for Chinese is technology. The second one is national security, and then data security, and then China's global partnerships, especially in Africa. And the fourth one is international cooperation. For the EU side, the first one is EU's role or EU Commission institution, and others are including like digital market, like defense system, EU's initiative to foster digital innovation and research projects, and last, data governance. Okay, next slide, please. And then we can see that in the proportion analysis shows that the topic 4 of the China's discourse is like the most prominent one, takes the most part. This one topic is about global cooperation, and in the EU's taxes, in the proportion is much more balanced at least, and the most one that takes the most is the EU's role. And in the sentiment analysis, we can see that the Chinese are the blue one, and most of them are negative, and only one topic is the least negative, is the global cooperation. And the EU side, most of them are positive, and the most top positive one are the third topic about innovation. Okay, next one, please. And this is actually my basic data analysis, and I'm still trying to figure out the implications from this data analysis. One thing that I could find is that China and the EU, they are using sovereignty as a conceptual tool to for their digital strategy. For example, China is like it's a state-based approach to sovereignty. Its concept is deeply tied to the state as the primary actor in digital governance. This aligns with China's broader strategy of advocating for state-led internet governance model and opposing external influence on domestic digital policy. And this is also aligned with China's advocate of building a shared common destiny of shared future in subspace, and it advocates a state sovereignty-based collaboration between different countries. And the EU's digital sovereignty is regulatory based. It tries to use its own rule to let others to comply with it. So their approaches are very different. So in the future, these two different approaches for digital governance or data governance will have very different visions for different countries, or attractive to different countries. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you. I'm so sorry to waste so much time.
No, perfect. Thank you so much, Grace. And it was perfect within time. And good job. It's always a bit of stressful when the presentation starts like this, but it was great. Thank you. Serhat, I would like to hear your thoughts, and please introduce yourself first. Thank you.
So should I make comments after each presentation, or would it be better I don't know how you have planned it.
Do you have a strong preference?
I don't know. I mean, I've assumed that I would speak at the end and another round of questions, but I don't know what Jamal thinks. It's to be because the topics may actually, I think some papers have a lot in common, so it would be maybe easier to. But in any case, if you want, I can, or no. I can.
No, I think your suggestion is the best. Let's do it at the end. Yeah. All right.
Should I still introduce myself, or also at the end? I think it makes more sense at the end.
Let's move it all towards the end, so that people will remember. It's okay. And then we will go to the second presentation of today from Pilar. Pilar, is that okay? Yeah. Perfect. Also about digital sovereignty and the fractured landscape of internet governance. If you could share your slide, please.
I hope it works. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
I'm just going to set my timer so I don't time. Perfect. Okay, so thanks, Sophie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pilar, and I'm going to present my research on digital sovereignty and its relationship with geopolitics that I've done in collaboration with Jorge Pérez and Alberto Urueña from the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid and the Internet Governance Forum in Spain. So, one of the first issues that we ran into when we were starting this research was that we don't all agree on a definition for digital sovereignty. And it depends on the perspective that you want to take, and it varies greatly. So if you look at it from a government perspective, you will get notions of control, authority, like Grace just said. But when you look at it from the tech company perspective, such as Google or Amazon, you will find an approach more based on how the user can handle their data and security around their infrastructure. But then again, if you look at how the citizens view digital sovereignty, it's more about taking control over what you do over the internet, who you share your data with, what information can you access. So in our research, we have tried to join these different perspectives together to measure the degree in which a country has achieved digital sovereignty. So to do so, first, we ask the questions, can you have digital sovereignty without technology? Well, the answer is no. Now, we don't mean owning the whole value chain, but there's a certain importance in participating in the global digital ecosystem, and more so in creating the right alliances to ensure resilience of your own local economy. Second, we look at the government. Traditional sovereignty does imply that governments have the final say, so they're like the maximum authority over a territory. But in the digital realm, national frontiers are a lot more diffuse. So here in Europe, we know a lot about regulating. We have the GDPR, we have the Digital Services Act, we have the Data Act, we have the Data Governance Act. And all these regulations influence companies and users inside the EU. And we do have the power to enforce these regulations. So governments do have a certain amount of say in what is going on inside their borders. But there's always a way of bypassing this. So for instance, through the dark web. And finally, we look at individuals. While still being chancellor in Germany, Angela Merkel said that digital sovereignty describes the ability both of individuals and of society to shape the digital transformation in a self-determined way. So while they're not often considered, individuals do have a high impact on how sovereign a nation is. If the people in your country do not have the tools and the knowledge to access the internet, it doesn't really matter how many regulations or technologies you have available because they're not going to use them. So with all this in mind, we created this framework where we have divided digital sovereignty into three categories: technology, governments, and society. And inside each of them, we have included different variables that describe the internal characteristics and global interactions. So in technology, we have next generation infrastructure, so 5G, internet service providers, global exchange points. We have also included the economic impact of ICTs, so how much a certain country contributes to the ICT trade through export and import. We have the knowledge creation, so we have patents in ICT, AI publications, knowledge impact through the creation of unicorns. Right now is very important for the EU in the digital compass. Software spending. We have future technologies because it's important to measure how ready you are for the coming years. So how ready you are with artificial intelligence, with blockchain, with IoT, nano robotics. And finally, we've included trust in this technological sovereignty because we believe that cybersecurity and having secure servers inside your country really brings a new perspective to the whole technological side. Next, on the state sovereignty, we have made the differentiation between institutions. So how good your institutions are online, how are they providing their services online, how good are they at promoting emerging technologies, and regulatory environments. So how much regulation you have around e-commerce, for instance. And finally, we have the social sovereignty, which is education levels of the society, the use of ICTs, and the inclusion, for instance, in closing gender gaps and the urban-rural gap. So we've added all these variables up, and we got this beautiful index that we presented in this figure. Among the top performers, we have the US, Singapore, Korea. We find some European countries. You have Germany, France, Finland, all these countries that do have this resilience, not just because they create technology, but because also they have the right alliances. They have resilience in their economic structure. And next, we call them the medium-high performers. So we have China in this group, we have Israel, we have Spain, Italy, most of Europe here. We have some emerging technologies like Brazil, Turkey, Russia. And on the lower spectrum, we have Indonesia, India, other emerging technologies that do not contribute so much to the digital value chain, but they are starting to. They're starting to go over this notion that we have of them, of just global factories or global service providers. And they have the tools to do so in the terms of population, in the terms of economic development. And finally, we have the lower performers, which include most of the African regions, some Asian countries that haven't been able to introduce digitalization as part of their economic processes, but that are still a great market to enter. So here we find it most interesting to see how each country manages to achieve digital sovereignty. So while some focus mostly on technology, like the United States or Korea or China, others prefer to do it through state or their social structure, for instance, European countries or Japan. It's true that the European Union is trying to reverse this, for instance. It's become a more technological player. So Madam Ursula von der Leyen announced recently the investment of 200 billion euros in the development of AI in Europe. But we still have many years to see the results of these investments, to see if they pay off, and to see if we can become bigger players as Europe as a whole, in not just being digitally sovereign, but in the whole digital ecosystem. So changing to the second part of our article, we've looked deeper into the relationship between digital sovereignty and geopolitics. And much like digital sovereignty, geopolitics is rather difficult to measure. Luckily for us, the University of Harvard developed a proxy they call the geopolitical position, that is measured in the difference in votes at the United Nations General Assembly. And we have represented it in this map, showing the United States as the center. So we see countries like Canada, like the European Union, Australia, Japan, Korea, countries that are traditionally aligned with the US, but that most of the global South and Asia is mostly aligned with China. These results haven't really surprised us, but it has allowed us to see the relationship between digital sovereignty that we've calculated and the geopolitical distances between countries. So on the left side, we have the United States and its whole allies bloc. We see that most of the United States allies do tend to have higher levels of digital sovereignty, which does led us to believe that it's not so much about protectionism, it's not so much about the whole Chinese model that Grace introduced us before about the whole state dominance, but mostly about creating alliances with trusted partners. While on the other side, we have China with most of the BRICS countries, Africa. But the problem with this, like we said before, is that these are emerging economies. These are the most populated regions in the world, and they have huge potential when they actually manage to bring all the benefits of the internet and the digitalization to their economies. And in the middle, we have let's say middle countries like Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, India. Now these countries are playing both sides. They create they create alliances with China, but they also try to create alliances with NATO countries. So, and they have the opportunity to do so because they do have high levels of sovereignty compared to other countries in the Chinese bloc. So we are still seeing where this is all going now with the new geopolitical positions that countries are taking. But we do think that this will not change too much. Allowances will keep on going the same way that they are. And I think I sit in time, so that's great. Thank you very much. And I'm glad I'll be hoping to hear your comments.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, Pilar. And indeed, very precisely on time. So that's always great. Then I suggest to go to the third presentation of this panel from Francesca Musiani and Clément Perarnaud. Yep.
Thank you so much. So actually, Clément will be sharing slides and start.
Perfect.
Then I'll take over at some point.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Perfect.
Perfect. So thanks again to the organizers of this event. My name is Clément Perarnaud. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the VUB in Belgium. And today I'm going to present a research project I've been working on with Francesca Musiani as part of a project called QUIC. So in this article, we look at the process of formulating and deploying a new IETF standard for Internet Engineering Task Force, a protocol that is called QUIC and which was developed in the previous decade. As we will see, some consider that QUIC could profoundly transform the global internet. Initially developed in-house by Google, QUIC has been proposed as a possible alternative to address TCP's limitations at the transport layer of the internet, offering a new technical architecture for communicating and encrypting communications across the network. I don't really have the time to go into the detail, but this diagram illustrates the relative reconfiguration of layers that QUIC could create. One of the aims of this research is to understand what has been infrastructured by QUIC, and to do so, we are documenting three controversies that shaped the QUIC negotiation process, controversies that are linked to encryption, state sovereignty, and surveillance. And through this study of the process by which this IETF standard was formulated, a key idea was also to understand what Google can do in the IETF. In other words, to observe its ability to reshape the internet's technical architecture, and more broadly, to apprehend the expected effects of QUIC on the global internet, which leads us to the research question that we focus on in this paper. What has been both enabled and constrained by the QUIC standardization process, and what are the implications for the future of the internet? I will just give you a quick word on the methodological approach, which combines political science and STS for science and technology studies, allowing us to see the way in which infrastructures can be promoted and co-opted for motives other than the technical functionalities they are initially intended to fulfill. We also draw on infrastructure studies and the notion of infrastructuring, particularly in the final part of the paper, applying it to the internet governance following Francesca Musiani's recent work. Our work is based on a qualitative analysis of the QUIC mailing list of the IETF, in addition to a series of interviews that were conducted online, but also during physical meetings of the IETF last year and the year before. And this brings me to the heart of our research, starting with the adoption process of this particular IETF standard. If we we have to make a very quick genealogy of QUIC, we need to first turn to Google, which in the years 2000s designed its own internal version of this protocol, which was known as GQuic, for its own services and servers. Without some of its users fully realizing it, GQuic was actually experimented with and then used by default on certain Google services, such as Google Chrome or YouTube, in the beginning of the previous decade. Following internal debates, Google saw an interest in expanding QUIC beyond its own infrastructure, and this debate at the time within Google was to decide whether the performance gains that QUIC would enable vis-à-vis competitors, and in particular in the cloud industry, were more profitable for Google than the performance gains that it would derive from a more efficient network globally. And so the interviews that we conducted also illustrated the extent to which the sophistication of this first Google initial proposal to the IETF can be explained by the mobilization of a range of resources. In particular, the development of QUIC must be understood in conjunction with a wave of first-rate engineering hires that has been done by Google, notably in the field of congestion management or encryption a little earlier. Another major advantage for Google was also in the design phase of its protocol. It was its ability to test its protocol on both clients and server sides over several years, and obviously it led to the sophisticated proposal that was then proposed in the context of the IETF. And so once Google came to the IETF with this idea of QUIC, in 2015, it led to a number of discussions and controversies on the mailing list and during in-person meetings up till the 2021 with the final adoption of the standard. And in this research, we focus on three social-technical controversies which were identified by the actors in this process as particularly central. The first one is the fallback option. It's basically deciding what happens if a QUIC connection fails. The second one was determining what would be the cryptographic model that would encrypt the data, and to what extent it should be considered mandatory or not, and what would be its scope. And the final one is known as the spin bit. It has been covered somehow already in the literature, and it was to decide or not whether we would the network operators would be given some visibility on the transport on the traffic that they would help channel. And so the interviews underline once again this great the resources of Google in this particular context. And what we see when looking at the outcome is that what is in the standard is not necessarily what Google came with, but still the process showed how Google was able to mobilize rather discreetly but effectively all the large players in this particular field in order to get a really solid consensus behind its proposal. Why does it really matter? Now we see that actually QUIC traffic is becoming a reality on most parts of the world. Here you have data from Cisco from last year, where you see that in Europe, the US, and other continents, half of the traffic, at least secured by Cisco, is using this particular protocol. And now I move to Francesca, who will present the rest of the publication.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Clément. So indeed, we are moving now towards a more like a discussion part of the paper, in which so one of the things that we discuss is this relation between state digital sovereignty and the QUIC, and the extent to which Google has conducted sort of a strategic preemption of a certain number of sovereignty claims. So indeed, what our interviews and observations have revealed is that many of the arguably most innovative features of QUIC in comparison to TCP protocol could be interpreted as a challenge to the ability of states and of national network operators to analyze the traffic and communications. So according to what one of our interview respondents mentioned, QUIC doesn't really let the network operator inspect, and to put it in his own words, it is designed that way specifically to defeat certain kinds of state sovereignty. Next slide, please. I guess that. Thank you. So there is an indirect effect of QUIC's global deployment on states' network visibility that can be defined as a control inversion. So this rapid and massive deployment of QUIC at the global level could further alter the ability of states to resort to the fallback process. And so informal discussions within these companies, for example, suggest that you could soon, so imagine somebody removing the fallback. You could imagine a client that says, I'm only willing to talk QUIC, or a service that is only willing to listen to QUIC and not do like other options, TCP, TLS over TCP, and be willing to say that failure is a hard failure. So we have a last part in our paper that we have called Google Among the Machines to really figure out a little bit better like the extent to which Google has positioned itself via the QUIC ensemble of processes. So from a technical standpoint, QUIC is arguably a fundamental, an evolution that can be quite fundamental core for the internet architecture, because as one of the first slides Clément showed, mentioned quite clearly in a graphical way, QUIC indeed brings everything, or a fairly more substantial part of the application layer, making most of the layered models that have historically represented the internet almost irrelevant abstractions. So this shift indeed invites for a discussion of its implications for what it means in terms of internet consolidation, notably. And indeed, what we have seen is somewhat of a Darwinian process in which QUIC provides a case in which the content and application industry has actually attempted, and quite successfully so, to conclusively take over the lower layers carriers industry in a strategic way, and one that could hardly be went back on. It could be irreversible potentially. So in this process, the arguments of limited latency or stronger privacy were used simultaneously by QUIC proponents, such as Google and also Meta, the Facebook's and Instagram's parent company, which did not shy away from using a number of privacy motives, for example, to actually blind network operators from their traffic. So to move towards some conclusions, and some of those are actually open questions that, especially the last one, will actually be very interesting to discuss and to know more what you think about it in this particular arena and panel. So QUIC standardization process, we have analyzed them really as a site where infrastructuring takes place. So where infrastructure is seen and not as a static entity, but as a set of evolving processes, where also like the standpoint of the researcher can evolve and influence the way in which this infrastructuring is understood. And in this ensemble of processes, there are different socio-technical dynamics that emerge that involve various actors, and in which big tech has a central political role. Discussions and controversies on specific technical aspects of a standard that we really had a little time to go into in this particular presentation, but form a substantial part of our article, and maybe we can come back to them in the Q&A. These discussions and these controversies are actually ways to reconfigure broader balances of power and of decision-making on the present and close future on the internet. And one of the things that has particularly tickled our researchers' brains in terms of how digital sovereignty is defined today, or could be defined according to like our input as researchers, is can digital sovereignty of private actors exist to some extent if a set of conditions come up? First of all, a status of quasi-monopoly or sheer size, or the capability of implementing one's own infrastructure, such as cables, for example. And if we can admit, or at least debate this question, has Google, with the QUIC processes, taken one more step towards building its own digital sovereignty in some way? Thank you very much, and we hope to have some discussion. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
You are muted, Sophie. I'm sure.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for letting me know. I was saying thank you so much for the presentation. And then finally, it's time. I introduced him already 3 times. Well, asked him to introduce himself, but now it's really happening. Serhat, I would like to hear your thoughts about the presentation.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for the presentations. I think, I really enjoyed them, and well, thanks for all the work. My name is Serhat Tutkal. Well, I'm a Kurdish researcher who is currently based in Mexico. I'm doing a postdoctoral research stay funded by the Mexico's newly funded Secretary of Science, Humanities, Technology, and Innovation. I mostly work on political violence and digital platforms. Especially, that is what I usually work on, how the intersections between the racism, dehumanization, legitimation of state-sponsored violence through digital platforms. That's what I usually work on. Today, the topic of digital sovereignty, actually, it is very interesting to me, especially since at a certain point as a graduate student, I was very interested in political philosophy. So I think I may briefly start thinking about the importance, the growing importance of the term, and why we are talking particularly about the digital sovereignty. Because in the end, even though the meanings of words, certain concepts do change over time, but still these words have some baggages, right? And sovereignty is a very loaded term in political studies. So I would like to briefly think about the context in which the term was coined. Right, especially by Boden and the following theories, mostly of the social contract, particularly Hobbes and Rousseau. And they were using this term in a time of radical political change, in which we have this new institution which is being built at the time, the modern state, a secular political institution, and which was trying to change the source of legitimacy and basically theorize this new political situation, in which the major aim was undoing the church authority in the context of Europe. So basically we have this new modern secular government who doesn't want to be restricted by the religious authorities anymore. So the term sovereignty comes in such a context, which will be accompanied by the change of the source of legitimacy from the God to abstract people based on the will of these people. So I underline this particularly because I think we are in a very interesting time in terms of the change in the political structure. So I think that has something to do with it. There's something to do with the increasing importance of the discussion. So basically, the use of political power that comes with the sovereignty is transferred to a ruler who was obviously limited, especially in terms of materiality, because the materiality always limits us. I mean, there are certain things we cannot do based on the material conditions, but it was humanly unlimited. It was coined in such a way, and unconditional right to especially make, interpret, and execute law. So it is very it is really interviewed with the legal aspects. So basically, the ruler is saying that when I make a law, a reasonable law, considering the material conditions, at least, and certain traditions, but the law I am making should not be limited by any other human authority, including the church, and I can execute this law without interference. So this was, let's say, it was built as a continuous thing, so it was not limited with the individuals interpreting and executing these laws, the sovereign ruler at the time, and it was also indivisible in terms that it was not possible to share this, and all of this was basically coming to a change of the actors who will be executing more and more political power. But it had two aspects, and I see that the most discussions about digital sovereignty focus on one of them, while the other is more ignored, I would say, because sovereignty obviously meant different things in the international arena and the national arena. You know, the state is sovereign both within its own territory and also in the international area. And the literature, most literature, at least on digital sovereignty, focus on this international arena in terms of the interstate relations. But also this being a sovereign, having the sovereignty also means being able to do certain things in the national context, like with local actors. And the thing, for example, is this independence of the state or other actor, which I'll return, also means that not being challenged by local actors, right? And I have this interesting research going on based on a large data set in the context of Turkey, since I do work on armed conflicts in the Turkish-Kurdish conflict. So basically, not just to exemplify, I mean, there were three main, based on retweet networks, there were three main political groups, like one pro-Kurdish group, one secular nationalist opposition group, and one pro-government group. Then, based on a large vocabulary, 8 million tweets were collected on real time in 2021, pre-mask Twitter. So what I was interested in that was that what tweets are blocked or they receive access restriction by the nation, by Twitter, the platform. And I find that 99.85% of restricted tweets belong to pro-Kurdish community, while at the same time I'm working on a process of dehumanization and violent discourses, hate speech targeting Kurds. So what happens is that Twitter was only blocking tweets when there is court orders, like the national court, and the national courts were only blocking tweets published by pro-Kurdish accounts. So actually, so there is this thing which is very relevant to the presentations, in that when we have this kind of an infrastructure which is not built and controlled by the state cannot really inspect it, but at the same time they can use it, and it is this infrastructure is something that the states cannot build by themselves. Like the Turkish state was not capable of building such a complex communication platform, transferring most discussions to one single platform where they can effectively use censorship through the private company, but they could, because the company is respecting the national court orders. So actually what happened was that the whole discussion moves to a social media platform. Then the Turkish courts effectively censored the discussion on this platform. And since there is this monopolization of the political discourse, what happens is that the pro-Kurdish voices are effectively excluded from the discussion at once, which comes with the normalization of the state-sponsored violence and all these things, which is my argument, but it can work on non-violent context too. But so there is this interesting thing that is happening, which has been theorized as neoliberal authoritarianism, especially by Ian Bruff. In Marxist studies, actually the concept comes from Latin America, but in military dictatorships in Chile, in Uruguay back then, because these states were very authoritarian, but they were also very neoliberal, like as we know from the case of Chile, the Pinochet. So actually there was this kind of an alliance between a neoliberal policies and a very strong anti-democratic executive. So what happened, according to Bruff and some others, is that after the 2007-2008 crisis, the so-called global north, especially in Europe, is starting to adopt certain aspects of these policies because the neoliberal policies are becoming more and more unpopular, which means that we need an executive that is unbound by democratic mechanisms, all these brake mechanisms, so they can swiftly execute these neoliberal policies, which are being contested by the people now. So I think this context helps explaining a bit this alliance. So I'm not, we are, I think we tend to think that based on the Cold War era, actually the private versus the state. But actually, in more and more, we see that these boundaries are getting blurred, especially with what happened in the US. I think a lot of people realize that, but it has been happening in a long time, actually, that the executive and the market is getting more and more closely intertwined. And this creates a whole new range of questions. In that the private companies, for example, the US-based companies, especially with Musk, but also with others, with Zuckerberg, with Bezos, now we cannot really talk about they are neither state-owned, but they are not as really private as how we were using the term 20 years ago. So there is this weird relationship in that there is a market influencing the executive, but also being controlled by the state. And this creates obviously the questions that are mentioned in the literature about the colonialism, the imperialism, and the digital sovereignty as a response by the states. But I would like to make an open question also that why are we thinking about digital sovereignty, for example? What would this term means as, for example, we could have talked about self-rule, self-determination, autonomy, but what emerged from the field was digital sovereignty. I mean, we are using the term because that is the term we have, because that is what emerged. But the sovereignty, as I mentioned, is directly linked to modern state. When we talk about autonomy, self-rule, even self-determination, we are talking about non-state actors. As a Kurd myself, I know that the self-determination, the difference between sovereignty and self-determination actually implies state involvement. So there is a contestation, like the nation states are contesting to what we may call foreign intervention, and they are demanding more and more ability to, especially in terms of legal sovereignty, which I would like to mention also based on Pilar's presentation, because it wasn't a category by itself, but actually I think this legal sovereignty in terms of let's say a supreme legal authority, as in the ability to command compliance. I think this is very important, and this has been a huge issue and a huge conflict between the states and digital platforms in that they are demanding compliance. For example, in Turkey, it has a lot to do with the freedom of speech, but other cases are more related to economic aspects of it, privacy aspects of it, but actually there is an important legal sovereignty. Like we will ask for compliance, and we should be able to punish individuals who are violating our laws. So that is there is this tension, and there is this also let's say that these countries trying to achieve, I think, aiming to achieve digital sovereignty in a certain part, they are trying to establish this legal authority over what happens in digital space, and it affects them. And this, let's say, this is justified by a lot of discourses, especially on discourses mentioning anti-colonial, anti-imperialist positions, especially with considering how much the US government is currently influencing these platforms. But also, once this sovereignty is established, there is a problem coming with that. Let's say that the sovereignty is established in order to protect the certain legal, economic, social interests which are considered threatened by overly monopolizing private enterprises. But once it is established, it can be used against local actors, limiting their democratic abilities, limiting their freedoms, which happens in certain authoritarian countries. Yes, my example is usually Turkey, but it has been happening in a lot of countries. It happened in Saudi Arabia. It happened in many countries. But once the sovereignty is established, it means that it cannot be contested by local actors. This creates, in a certain way, it is anti-colonial, but in a certain way, it also brings some anti-democratic tendencies to an internet, which has been for some time as a space that allowed these movements to survive. So I would like to invite everyone to think about this balance between international sovereignty and the national local domination, contesting actors, especially in terms of media freedom, academic freedoms, and also the economic aspect of it, in which certain economic activities have been banned. But the interesting thing is, and what I would like to mention in the end, based on Francesca's and Clément's presentation, is that how we also see and maybe tend to overlook that the agency of non-human actors in the infrastructure. I mean, these private companies, the states, they are coming up with, they have certain objectives, but also we should think about how these, the outcome is rarely what they intend to achieve, because it depends on certain materialities, or at least the material aspects of the software of the internet itself, that doesn't always result in what is the intention. I mean, the states and private enterprises trying to control the interactions occurring on internet are sometimes creating platforms that they would rather not prefer. And I think maybe this is also an important part of this sovereignty, because the digital sovereignty, this unlimited idea, as it was coined by Bhorat and still considered such by certain people, it is actually limited by, I will say, the nature, for the lack of a better term, the nature of internet itself. And this I think is also is a last comment, in that we may start thinking about how the digital sovereignty can be limited, not by other sovereign actors, but maybe a certain autonomous, grassroots, self-governing, non-state and non-private communities in which would mean, translating to, in my opinion, a more democratic use of the internet and a non-centralized federated internet. Well, thank you very much, and I hope I didn't take a lot of time.
All right. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Is there any of the speakers that would like to respond, or alternatively, are there other questions among you? Yeah, I see one question. Lyudmila, you can go ahead.
Hello. I'm not sure that this is like really a question, but first of all, I would like to congratulate the designers of this panel because it was really great, and each part and presentation really fits the others and expands our understanding of digital sovereignty. For instance, Grace focused on these differences between the Chinese and the EU approaches, and then Pilar greatly explained the EU understanding of sovereignty. And I was surprised to find that actually in their framework, Finland, the country I am based in, is almost on the same level as the US, and actually ranked higher than China. I would assume that people or experts from China would be really amazed to hear or to see such results. And then, of course, what Francesca and Clément stressed in their part, that while talking about different approaches to sovereignty and different political discourses, we should not forget that we have another developments and processes. And indeed, Google could soon talk about its own sovereignty. And I also agree with Serhat that actually we didn't have enough of context that somehow could help us to come to a general conclusion. And I would suggest, I will put it in the chat, a link to a book written by Anu Bradford. I am not sure that you know this kind of literature because it's legal one. The name is Digital Empires. Maybe you have heard about that. And she talks about three models, European, American, and Chinese. Of course, Serhat would criticize because he talked about a different one, Turkish. And of course, there are more. And maybe we should include in the picture Google as a digital empire. But I guess it's something that you can use to begin with, and then to go back to reevaluate and maybe criticize, or maybe use to criticize yourself. Like, is your approach is really comprehensive? Or should we also think of other approaches to digital sovereignty? And maybe even those are not enough. We have even more. So I will put it in the chat, but I don't have any good questions for the panelists. Sorry for that.
No problem at all. Thank you for your comments. Jamal, I see your hand raised.
So, hey, I remembered to unmute myself. That's already a big thing. But yeah, thanks very much for those presentations. I had a couple of what I see as maybe easy to answer concrete questions that may not be that easy to answer. I'll go in reverse order, if that's okay. For the first question, Francesca and Clément, I'm really fascinated as to how you say that QUIC is kind of Google's way of maybe preempting digital sovereignty discussions. But one thing I'd like to know is, did you think, so you've looked at QUIC, but what about looking at TCP, so the underlying original internet protocol, right? You actually, because you say that QUIC kind of preempts digital sovereignty claims, did TCP IP actually enable digital sovereignty? Did TCP IP allow states to carry out digital sovereignty practices? I mean, for me, I think that's also a question. I don't think it. I mean, I'm not sure how you see that. Whether TCP IP is actually just the space where states can carry out digital sovereignty. I was also then a rather more technical question. So you said that there is a fallback option for QUIC. It wasn't clear to me, and I'm sure this is easy to answer, but it wasn't clear to me if this could be turned off at the behest of states or not. And I think what you were arguing is that it couldn't. So that was one question for you. For Pilar and your co-authors, thank you very much for your paper. Anything with graphs, I love, but but I was also really fascinated to see how the US tops off all digital sovereignty indexes without actually talking about digital sovereignty itself. I found this fascinating. Whenever I'm giving talks about digital sovereignty, I always say, well, the only elephant in the room is the United States, because they never talk about digital sovereignty. And then I see that they are the sovereigntist, the most sovereign of all, according to your index. And I was a bit surprised to see that. Also thinking about different terms that, I know how you've created that, but it was also very interesting in that sense. And I was wondering whether that enters into your reflection at all. And then Grace, the question I wanted to ask to you was, thanks very much for presenting this very rich analysis of all of these documents. I have many questions about the graphs and would love to see a paper that accompanies this. But one of the things I was most interested in was that at one point you showed a frequency analysis of the number of times that the Chinese government has talked about digital sovereignty compared to the EU, and your axis for the Chinese documents were 250. It went up to 250, and on the EU side it went up to 8. And you tried to show that there was this kind of interesting rise in the numbers, but the numbers are remarkably different. I mean, 250 that's 30 times more, right? So was the Chinese government really talking 30 times more about cyber sovereignty than the European Union? Is that important? Does that bear in anything? And then another thing I wanted to say was, you, in your sentiment analysis, and I'd love to know a bit more about how that actually worked. In China, it went up in 2019, right? Now, if I remember correctly, that's before COVID. I don't remember when COVID was anymore, but China was talking positively about, or the sentiment analysis that you did looked positive for the Chinese government prior to the pandemic and the lockdown, and then it slid again. So from that, can we draw that China actually became much more pessimistic after COVID? And if we hadn't had COVID, we might be looking at a different world completely. Anyway, that's my 3 different concrete questions around. And Jyoti also has, anyway, Sophie, I pass the floor back to you.
Yes, perfect. Well, I think I would like to hear from the speakers if they would like to respond. I think it was a specific question to Clément first. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks a lot for all the questions and for the discussions. And I will give the floor in a second to Francesca, because I'm sure she has many things to add. But on the question from Jamal, on what is enabled by QUIC as opposed to the pre-existing situation. So you have to understand that the encryption of the internet traffic that is allowed by QUIC goes beyond and give less visibility to network operators and was known in the pre-existing configuration. And that actually allows us to explain why do we actually talk about digital sovereignty in this particular paper. It's mainly because QUIC was formally adopted at a time when many countries of the world, including in the EU, were advocating for their digital sovereignty, notably in internet standard setting processes. It was adopted finally in 2021, once again. And so our main question was to see what was the reaction of the states, to what extent they were participating in the AETF, to what extent those claims around digital sovereignty were part of the IETF discussion. And what we saw was that mostly state actors were absent. It doesn't mean, however, that they were not part of the discussion. Actually, the issues of states' control over networks and even state surveillance was at the center of the debates and regularly used as a justification for both limiting or expanding encryption of the traffic. So state sovereignty were negotiated in a way, but in the absence of states. And the reason why they were rather absent from the mailing list, at least our understanding from the interviews, is that Google and other companies were developed a sophisticated strategy and using this particular fallback option as a escape hatch, basically a way to make sure that the state are not so concerned about this particular process because they knew they could resort to this fallback option if they wanted to. I've been already too long, so I'll give the floor to Francesca now.
Thank you. On my end, I guess that maybe I wanted to build on something that Serhat was mentioning about indeed the material aspects and the agency of non-state actors, because indeed it is something that I tried to highlight a few years back in an article which I called Infrastructure in Digital Sovereignty, in which basically there are two things that I was putting forward that maybe could help complementing more institutional and typically international relations perspectives on digital sovereignty, that science and technology studies approaches and infrastructure studies approach could bring. So the first was that we could try and figure out how the digital sovereignty label becomes really instantiated in a number of infrastructures that are usually directed at some form of control, in which like institutional and other actors do different forms of co-optation of these infrastructures as proxies of their authority. And in methodological terms, it means to understand infrastructures as analytical sites where processes of standardization, institutionalization, and so on become visible, and where we can detect some transformations in the order of authority and in how power is redistributed. So basically what I think that STS can bring to understanding like these more material aspects and the non-state agency to the understanding of digital sovereignty is refers to these sets of procedures that are material, that are technologically embedded, and where there are institutions or hybrids of public institutions and the private sectors that operate. They operate in specific territories, or at least the spatial understandings of power, or where this power can be exerted. And this eventually makes the notion of digital sovereignty more plural. And this includes, and I'll stop after this, the more self-determination related aspects of digital sovereignty that are called digital sovereignty increasingly so by specific communities or groups that, for example, seek to preserve sets of data that are constitutive of the identities of these groups. I'm thinking about Maori in Australia, or like communities such as or territories such as Quebec in Canada that are also calling digital sovereignty the sets of practices that seek to preserve particular infrastructures or data, or both, that are constitutive of their identity. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Grace and Pilar, is there anything you would like to comment on?
Thank you, Professor. Very sharp analysis and observation. I have not noticed about that before. I think, yeah, it's very remarkable that the Chinese frequencies of sovereignty is so much more than Europeans. But I think when the EU mentions about sovereignty, it's already something significant. So so I'm comparing the trend between them. But the trends are quite similar. And also about the 2019 wide rise to some extent. I don't know actually, but I checked the policies. In 2019 in China, there was no policy regarding to cyberspace was issued. So I found that when there was some kind of policy, the sentiment was negative, and when there was no policy, it tends to be more positive. And in 2019, there was a white paper issued by the World Internet Conference. It's called "Sovereignty in Cyberspace: Theory and Practice." I think maybe that document doesn't have so much negative sense in that, so maybe that's a reason. And also in the EU side, in 2019, it has a very sharp increase. I think maybe because they issued some strategic policies or strategies regarding digital sovereignty. So there's a very, they are very different. And about the questions in the chat, someone asked that, what do I think about the Xi bringing together tech CEOs? Is this a state stepping in support of domestic industry or asking them to align themselves with state objectives? I would say the first one. I think it's a signal of support to the domestic industry. But maybe the second would be also possible. But I would say the first one is more possible. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Grace. Pilar, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, I'd like to thank Serhat for his comprehensive overview of sovereignty, because he really brought the context of the whole three presentations together. So thank you for that. And well, regarding what you mentioned about the legal sovereignty, I completely agree that that it's important to see how you can get compliance. It's true that it's hard to measure and include it in an index with numbers, but it really brings a perspective, and we really look into it. So thank you for that. And for Mila, that she mentioned that China was lower than the some EU states. It's true that we've taken a more European and, let's say, Western approach towards digital sovereignty. We've tried to include the whole perspectives, but as Grace mentioned, China does tend to have a more almost techno-nationalist approach to digital sovereignty. It's she mentioned control, state, national security as things that they comment that are close to it, and we went more for a strategic alliance cooperation approach. But it's true that if you add different this other perspective, it would probably go higher up in the index. And Jamal, thank you for your question. It's true that the US doesn't mention it. I read an article, I don't remember right now which one, but they did say that they don't mention it because they have it already, like from the beginning. It's like they don't have the European problems with dependencies on US companies because they're US companies. They don't have the problems of dependencies with things coming from China because they can manufacture them in the US. So they don't have those problems. They already have sovereignty. So they're like the cool parents here. But we're trying to, the EU is really trying to get closer. We have the CHIPS Act. We have the whole AI investment that I really think will bring us closer to the leaders in the race.
All right, thank you very much. Then I would like to bring our attention to the questions that were asked by Yoti in the chat, and Grace already answered one of them. I would like to give the floor to Yoti to ask the other two.
Thank you so much and lovely presentations. I actually want to compliment Serhat because he brought in the most poignant question of all, that why are we so stuck on the term digital sovereignty? And for me, sitting here in India, I saw a glimmer of hope when Europe kind of started talking about strategic autonomy. And therefore, why a preference for a certain term over the other is a question that I am personally grappling with in my research. Thanks for your answer, Grace. Pilar, I don't mean to put you in a spot, and I know you haven't really worked in the compliance aspect of it, but in India, the sovereignty approach, especially regards data, which I study, is very much coming from the perspective that we want to compel tech companies in other jurisdictions to listen to us and to kind of follow our rules. And if that was incorporated, do you think that India would kind of change? Because I think on that, if we're coming at sovereignty from that perspective, then India has been pretty persistent in their ideology and are not swinging as much. And Francesca and Clément, again, great presentation, learned so much. I am curious if conflating the idea of, or not even conflating, but bringing in market forces and how they try to seek dominance and, consolidation. If we move away from these terms into a sovereignty-based understanding, and I do understand that a lot of these digital sovereignty efforts, including in India, cannot be just pursued by the states. Private sector, whether it's local or whether it's international in many cases, is very integral to these efforts. So how do we then, as scholars of this domain, kind of make that distinction that this is purely a state-led strategy and therefore sovereignty? I mean, that's how I was approaching it, but I'm curious to learn more if in your study of Google and its efforts, do you see a benefit of incorporating and expanding the term to cover market efforts beyond state-led efforts?
All right, thank you very much for your question. Would like to respond, Claire? Pilar, go ahead.
Well, it would probably change the results of the index if you add more variables, if you add more complexity to it. But the thing is that it's also a relative index. So if you add, for instance, the compliance, other countries would change as well. So the thing is, how much would they change in relationship to India? So the US has compliance, the European Union has compliance, other countries have less. So it would really vary, depend on the relative position with respect to other countries.
All right. Thank you very much. Clément, would you like to respond or?
Yes, I was waiting for Francesca, but I'm sure
me too, but I can't see her, so go ahead.
I can take the floor. So the idea indeed is to, the reason, our starting point once again when we are referring to digital sovereignty is to use the discourse of the actors and notably the EU, but also actors. So that's how we ground the notion initially. But as Francesca explained in the conclusion of our presentation, the idea is to look at the actors in control and the technical systems that and the affordances that they create for the end users and state, and question to what extent this new protocol can grant a form of increased control to Google, and not only to Google, but the industry in itself, and to what extent this is related to this discussion around control and sovereignty of our infrastructure and data flows. I wonder, I don't want to preempt the question of Francesca, so feel free to...
It's great. I was just, maybe I could just provide a compliment that would be more STS driven, in which that I know is not satisfactory for all and for all approaches, but an STS-like answer to this would be, we observe things that are happening that can be alike to what states consider digital sovereignty that are put forward by private actors because they can, brackets, like they can because of their size, their de facto power, their ability to set de facto standards and so on. So I guess that our last point was in some way about not necessarily about putting the same label as a digital sovereignty to what this private sector is doing, but to observe that there are many alike phenomena and levers that are actually leveraged by these actors, and if not to put the same label, to observe parallels between them, and if this can reconfigure in any way the way we are defining digital sovereignty. But yeah, it's a sort of a bottom-up and observation-based response to the question. But I'm not sure if it brings clarity, but it can open up ways to reconfigure a definition of things that at least give food for thought. But I'm not sure that we are stabilizing anything here. We're more like opening up things further.
Yes, but well, thank you for that, though. I think that's still also really important to sometimes just think out loud. But with that, it brings us to the end of this first panel. So in 30 minutes, so that is 3:30 Central European time, we will start again with our second panel. And I would like to thank all of the speakers from the first panel and our discussant, Serhat Tutkal, for his thoughts. And I hope to see you in 30 minutes. Thank you all. All right, and then I will just introduce the second panel of today. For this panel, the discussant is Berna Akçelagur, and I've asked her to make her comments after the presentations. So hopefully the second speaker will show up. But for now, we're going to listen to Claudiu, and about the paper Far from Consensus, Exploring the Role of Digital Authoritarianism and Hindering UN Discussions on Cyber Norms. Please go ahead.
Hey, thank you. First, a few words about myself. I'm Claudiu. I'm a researcher at the Romanian Diplomatic Institute, which is part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this research is actually part of still a work in progress. This particular study is part of a larger personal project that I've been having for the last few months. When I try to research the UN discussions on cyber norms. I've actually already published let's say, similar paper in this vein, where I try to explore how cyber operations kind of shaped, and if they shaped discussions, international discussions on cyber norms at the UN level. But for this research, firstly, the UN, I've studied the UN group of governmental experts in the open-ended working group process, which has been trying to set cyber norms since the early 2000s, and the consensus remains difficult despite the groups actually achieving to adopt several consensus reports. And second, cyber threats persist despite the absence of destructive cyber attacks. So we haven't seen the whole cyber doom scenarios and cyber apocalyptic scenarios of increased cyber warfare, targeting of, let's say, nuclear power plants and so on. But even though we haven't seen this, we're seeing a persistent engagement of low-level and low-intensity cyber operations between, let's say, Russia and the US or other Euro-Atlantic states. So the three research questions of this study: firstly, what are the main elements of digital authoritarian policies? How does digital authoritarianism hinder cooperation on cyber norms? and how can democracies overcome these challenges? Yes, and say some aims or like an outline of this research. Firstly, as I said, I explored the UN, GGE, and OEWG processes from the establishment of the first group of governmental experts on cyber norms in 2004.
I think I should listen to this. It's nice.
Okay. Give me a call.
Okay. And to the latest consensus report adopted by the Open-Ended Working Group 2 years ago. It also considers the most significant cyber operations that have occurred during this period of time, during the sessions, highlighting that certain cyber operations are part of influence campaigns that aim at promoting a digital authoritarian model at international level. And I'm going to go further into this in the next slides. Now, finally, the paper also discusses the main digital authoritarian policies and practices in China, for instance, or Russia, but as well as in democracies from the Western space, mainly the Euro-Atlantic area. And finally, the main recommendations explore how democracies should find common ground among themselves, firstly, and then manage to reach a consensus with other countries on issues such as, let's say, protecting human rights online, election interference, or securing critical infrastructure. Now, a few words about the UN process on adopting norms for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. The group of governmental experts sessions started in 2004. It adopted 4 consensus reports, the latest one in 2021, and it also includes the 2015 report, which brought forward the 11 non-binding UN norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. It was, especially at that time, a tremendous achievement and still is regarded as an achievement today. But unfortunately, the group of governmental experts actually did not adopt consensus reports in 2017, and it was close to not adopting one in 2021 too. And this is part of the reason of why the Open-Ended Working Group was established in 2019, I believe from a Russian-led initiative. First, it enlarged a group of states participating, and it managed to adopt 2 consensus reports in 2021 and 2023, which went forward into discussing the 11 non-binding norms adopted in 2015. I'm going to go very brief on this, the literature review for this study. This relation between the adoption of consensus reports by the GGEs and cyber operations has been discussed in the relevant literature, as well as the issue of international norms, complex regimes, and so on. But they did not focus on the UN processes, such as the research of Joseph Nye or Maria Rosaria Tadeu. Moreover, the UN, GGE, and OEWG discussions and cyber diplomacy have been covered in relevant literature, and they have been linked, of course, by Andrei Barinia, for instance, and other authors. And the concept of digital authoritarianism has been widely studied in relevant literature, and it's also been studied alongside the concept of digital repression, which was brought forward by Stephen Feldstein, arguing that the term of digital authoritarianism actually limits this concept because these kind of practices and tools are actually employed by states despite their regime. And it's more about repressing populations, domestic or foreign, and not only related to the concept of authoritarianism. Now, cyber diplomacy, of course, can be defined as diplomacy in the cyber domain, the use of diplomatic activities to secure national interests with regard to cyberspace. It is conducted in bilateral and multilateral formats, and it includes issues of cybercrime, internet governance, cybersecurity, and so on, including discussions in the UN forum. And the, let's say, main concept of this research, digital authoritarianism, it refers to the usage of digital means by authoritarian leaders or governments to repress, surveil, and manipulate domestic and foreign citizens. The primary promoters and adopters of this model are China and Russia, which have been using this model to strengthen their domestic rule, firstly, but also influence foreign actors and undermine Euro-Atlantic democracies, for instance. And both of them promote this kind of policies and, let's say, principles at the UN level. There are also some differences between their approaches, but what matters here is that sometimes, especially Russia in this case, employ offensive cyber operations against democratic states and also coordinated disinformation campaigns, which have political goals inside the country, which is maintaining the regime, and outside the country, challenging other states and undermining their institutions, and also attempting to alter or influence international norms on internet governance. I've given here some examples: Russia's internet control system or mechanism, the SORM, and China's state control cyberspace, which is the filters are a lot tighter than Russia's, and their export of this kind of policies and technologies. In the case of Russia, mostly to post-Soviet states. In the case of China, especially to African states, for instance. We're talking about, let's say, high-tech surveillance systems and so on. But the issue is not something, let's say, limited to authoritarian states or limited to China and Russia. As we can see in this map by Stephen Feldstein, most of the world adopt a mix of US and Chinese technology for AI surveillance systems. Of course, this is kind of a dual-use technology, because just having a surveillance system does not mean that you're going to automatically abuse it. It's used for law enforcement agencies, it's used for also, let's say, legitimate things. But as long as countries have authoritarian practices somewhere else, they're going to abuse it. But there are a few countries which only use US technologies, let's say Canada or South Korea or New Zealand, and also let's say more countries that use only Chinese technology because it is, let's say, cheaper than American technology. We have Morocco, Algeria, Mongolia, Iran, and so on, as you can see on the map. And now some examples of digital repression or digital authoritarian policies from the US and other Western states. Firstly, the widely known Snowden revelations in 2013, which actually opened the black box of the activities of US intelligence agencies regarding internet surveillance, and not limited to that. But we also have the issue of spyware and cyber weapons. We have the case of NSA's use and stockpiling of cyber weapons, but also recent issues of Israeli-based companies exporting spyware software to authoritarian regimes, for instance, which have been abusing them against their populations. We also have the issue of the encryption debates in the US and the EU. What are the limits of encrypting data and communications, and what are the limits of law enforcement agencies or intelligence services accessing people's private data and private communications? And of course, everything related to internet surveillance and control. Now here we have, let's say, two models. One is the EU's model of digital sovereignty, and attempting to regulate technology with the most recently the AI Act, and the US, let's say, more laissez-faire or even techno-libertarian, I might say, approach to internet and tech governance, especially now in the Trump's new administration. Now, the research aims to highlight that this pursuance of digital authoritarian practices by most of the world states is actually hindering international cooperation. and ensuring the means of continuing such policies of internet surveillance, reckless cyber espionage, and offensive cyber operations hinders cooperation and reaching consensus at the UN level. Overall, I can say that there are 2 or 3 loose groups of states, and they are far from acting as blocs. Some of the countries promote a democratic model, like EU member states, United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and so on, and others, let's say, an authoritarian one. Are the examples of China, Russia, Belarus, Cuba, and I think right before the change of the regime in Syria, Syria was also voting with Russia in tandem at the United Nations level. But nevertheless, a large part of the globe adopts a hybrid approach to internet governance, with countries such as Turkey, India, Brazil, Mexico, and so on. And as in the case of other UN processes, there are several alliances between states that are not like-minded in all aspects. So the regime category does not matter that much. Also, I've given here some examples which I've been talking about in the previous slides. But here I want to focus more on the issue of cybercrime because of course, there is a case of Iran or Russia tolerating or even using cybercrime groups to target democratic states from the Euro-Atlantic area. But cybercrime is an issue that affects most of the world states, including Russia, and Russia is really the main target of cybercriminals. And addressing this issue could actually represent an incentive to cooperate at the UN level, as we have seen in the newly adopted UN Treaty on Cybercrime. Now, finally, what I'm trying to promote here is the kind of that democratic states need an alternative model of internet governance, which has to be built on tight principles. We have, firstly, the example of the US-led Declaration on Free Internet, which tried to set forward the idea of a free, global, and secure internet, phrasing that is similar to EU's cybersecurity strategy adopted in 2020. And we also have, of course, the EU's approach to cybersecurity and the regulations adopted by the new AI Act. But we need larger coalitions of like-minded democracies to set enforceable norms and not only non-binding norms. And what we need is a blending of cybersecurity and human rights in a new governance model, which would put emphasis on privacy, encryption, internet freedom, and also on transparency and confidence building measures, including with, let's say, authoritarian states. So in the end, this kind of practices carried by both authoritarian and democratic states hinder cooperation and also reduce overall credibility in discussions regarding international cyber norms. And in conclusion, as I've said, digital authoritarianism or digital repression isn't just an authoritarian regime's problem. Western states also apply policies and practices associated with it. And this is leading to discussions from, let's say, the Russian part or the Iranian or Chinese part that Western states as a kind of double standards when it comes to their practices and their adversaries' practices. And this mistrust and the issue of defining cyber sovereignty in a borderless virtual world hinders norm setting at the UN level. And this is why putting forward a governance model that balances digital sovereignty, security, and human rights should be a priority of democratic states. And this is all. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for your presentation. Unfortunately, I have not so good news for the rest of our panel. So we were supposed to have 3 speakers today, one of which, Dennis Redeker, he informed us this morning that he can't be here because he got the flu. And now it appears that our second speaker also got hindered on the way. So therefore, I would like to give the floor to Berna, our discussant, to directly respond to this presentation. And then if we have, fortunately, we have enough time for us to ask our questions and our comments. So Berna.
Thank you, Sophie. So I'll start by introducing myself. I am lecturer in outer space law at Center for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University Law School. I am also associated with UNU-CRIS. I'm within the digital governance cluster. I also would like to mention, given this opportunity, that I am the membership chair for GigaNet. So if any one of you is not a member of GigaNet, please check our website. And if you have any questions, you can always contact me via email. Anyway, so my research focuses on public international law, world trade law, and EU law implications of advancements in information communication technologies. And so all three papers that were going to be presented here were of interest to me. We heard Claudiu's, and I think it is it was a very good presentation. Thank you, Claudiu. And I think you presented valid arguments and raised some important questions. Now, I always found the dynamic between the GGE and the open-ended working group fascinating. I referred to them in my previous research as well. So I'm always glad to hear new takes on their dynamic and the role of the UN in general in global governance of the internet, I will say. So now in your presentation, you have set forth some practices that could be considered authoritarian practices. But then you also said these practices are, we can see both democratic regimes and authoritarian regimes being engaged in these practices. So, and I think it is a very valid argument. So then I go back to one of your slides where you define digital authoritarianism. In that definition, you start by saying that digital authoritarianism is the use of digital means by authoritarian governments and leaders, and then so on. It goes on like that. So I'm thinking in the context of your presentation, should we change that definition and take out the actor and just define the action to define what digital authoritarianism means? Because if it is not only the authoritarian governments engaging in these practices, maybe we shouldn't refer to the actor anymore, but then it is just the actions that should be considered authoritarian. And following up on that question, do you see any distinction between digital authoritarian practices in authoritarian regimes versus democratic states? So now you have, I think, referred to some checks and balances that exist within democratic regimes. But considering that these don't really, these do not have the same effect when these practices are adopted for national security purposes. I'm trying to understand where they differ when these practices are adopted for national security purposes. And then in your last slide, I think, you mentioned balancing security with. So putting security in quotation marks, which security are we talking about? Are we talking about national security? Are we talking about cybersecurity? And are you considering security within national borders? Are you using the security concept as a more broader in a more broader context that transcends borders? So these are my 3 questions. And yeah, but I really enjoyed your presentation, and yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Perarnaud. Claudia, would you like to respond? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your questions and your comments. First, regarding the definition of digital authoritarianism, yes, I quite agree, and this is why, for example, Stephen Feldstein proposed the concept of digital repression, because it eliminates the word authoritarianism, and it doesn't refer, it's a more broader concept and doesn't stick to authoritarian leaders and authoritarian governments and so on. So I agree with this idea. And especially for this research, I think I'm maybe going to stick with digital repression, or maybe just shape the definition of digital authoritarianism so it doesn't only refer to authoritarian governments. And regarding the idea that what's the difference between digital authoritarian practices in democratic states and in authoritarian states. First of all, as you can see, democratic states are more accountable when it comes to their actions, both domestically and externally in other states. More transparent. We have civil society groups which monitor the government's actions, and also investigative journalism and so on. So eventually we're going to find out what kind of policies that the states have, what kind of practices that they have, because we found out from the media about the NSO group and the Pegasus spyware. We found out from the media about the Snowden's revelations and so on. But when it comes to authoritarian states, we found out mostly when democratic states are targeted, because they're going to issue a statement, they're going to accuse, of course, it's an alleged interference, an alleged influence operation. But I think this is the main difference, because in the end, when it comes to the idea of a global cybersecurity, all of these actions actually have an impact on cybersecurity on a global level and on the level of mistrust between all states. And regarding the idea of balancing security with, with cybersecurity measures and so on, or I'm referring mainly to national security, in this case, the aspect of hard security, because the idea here is how to balance protecting national security, let's say in the instance of communication of terror groups and so on, terror organizations. Because on one hand, intelligence services and law enforcement agencies want to have access, what criminals are talking on Telegram and so on, or WhatsApp or other software apps. They want to have access at their smartphones, having the ability to employ backdoors and accessing Android or the iOS operating systems. But on the other hand, this kind of backdoors, if implemented in phones or other devices, they can be exploited by foreign hacker groups, no matter if they are state or non-state. And also applying backdoors to encryption actually eliminates the idea of encryption as a whole. So this is mainly what I'm referring when I'm talking about balancing security with, let's say, digital freedom. Hope I've answered the questions.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. I see one hand raised. Jamal, you have a question?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Claudiu. And I think many of the questions that Berna raised were ones that I'm very interested in. I like this idea of thinking about the action rather than the actor. Because if we're all doing bad stuff, then why call us the good guys or the bad guys or whatever, And so I find that interesting to think about. But I was thinking in terms of a paper, right? You're trying to cover a huge amount of material in a kind of an article-based paper, right? Do I understand that this is an article that you want to get out of this? That's the first very simple question. You can just answer yes or no.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because for me it sounds, there's a lot going on in the paper talking about the GGE and the open-ended working group, so the group of governmental experts and the open-ended working group, and then also trying to map out these practices of digital authoritarianism within that context. I find that really useful, but I'm wondering how you want to kind of bring a focus to that in terms of getting what you can write in 7,000-8,000 words, right? And I was thinking there, would this focus really on actions and not actors help you? And how does that then play out in terms of the international frameworks that you're looking at? You're saying that you're looking at the group of governmental experts and the open-ended working group. Are there other spaces where it might be more effective to look at digital authoritarianism, like I don't know if some of the examples that you're talking about make me think of the Budapest Cybercrime Convention. Is this a space where you could actually identify these practices of authoritarianism and criminality in a different way or not? I don't know if that's really a question. So for me, the general theme is, how do I get this into yes, I know what Claudiu is talking about in terms of what does he want to, what's the headline of his article? If you're turning it into an article. Sorry if that sounded a bit mean, but I'm trying to frame it in a constructive way. Can you answer that even? I don't know.
Well, first of all, I know it sounds kind of too broad, and this is why I have said it's still a work in progress and still working on it. Maybe in the end, I'm going to write a full paper on it. Maybe I'm going to start realizing that it's too broad and I'm going to limit, let's say, to just the open-ended working group on just a particular time period. But the main idea here, especially focusing on actions and not actors, so focusing on general practices and policies of digital repression, trying to show that this kind of digital authoritarian practices employed by both, let's say, the Western space and Russia, China, and so on, are hindering discussions by reducing trust and also by, let's say, delegitimizing when Western states try to promote the idea of international law in cyberspace, respecting the UN non-binding civil norms, as long as Western states also employ similar, let's say, tactics to countries like Russia and China, and they're going to be accused of, double standards, double talk on these issues. And we have some examples besides, let's say, cyberspace. When you look at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the conflict between Israel and Palestine, what are the positions of the United States and European states regarding international law and regarding the International Criminal Court, for instance? which was recently sanctioned by Trump because it targeted, it investigated Israel. And this is similar issues like this are also occurring in the area of cyberspace. And let's say a particular case happened during the Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections in the US, when Russian operatives actually used to gain access to American systems. They've actually used some cyber weapons that were stockpiled by the NSA and were ultimately leaked online on say dark web public forums. So, employing this kind of tactics actually comes to the disadvantage of your own state, and as you've seen this example. I hope I've answered at least parts of your questions. Thank you.
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. Well, I have some great news because Hannah arrived in the meeting. So that was our speaker, Hannah Ismael. Hannah, could you unmute yourself?
Hi, yes.
Perfect. Do you also have a video or a PowerPoint maybe?
I do not.
Okay.
But I can verbally.
Yeah, no, that's great. So you will have 15 minutes maximum. And yeah, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So my paper is called Cascading Secrecy, Tensions Between Intellectual Property and Transparency Objectives. So secrecy is a feature, not a bug, for generative AI models. And I explore this as a regime of successive interrelations that involve, one, economic incentives towards secrecy based on high resource costs, two, legal protections through intellectual property and the doctrine of trade secrets, and three, policy concerns around public interest and tensions with technological innovation. So a clear example of this regime at work can be seen in recent EU AI regulations, which seek to both promote transparency ideals while also protecting trade secrecy. A proposed solution is global investment into open source AI, though such investment would need to be made across multiple layers of the generative AI stack. So across the AI supply chain, resources needed to develop a model remain incredibly high. This supply chain has been referred to as a stack, with outputs from prior layers feeding into successive layers as inputs. This stack can be broadly understood in four main layers: hardware, cloud infrastructure, the model itself, and then applications. And each layer sometimes feeds into the next. Generative models require a massive amount of compute or processing power, memory, and storage needed to handle the large amounts of data and complex calculations involved in AI. For this reason, hardware remains incredibly important in the stack. The cloud layer provides the infrastructure, the model layer is the focus of this paper and this presentation, and applications are built on top of the foundation models. Some of these bottlenecks are somewhat natural given physical resource and compute limitations, but some of these may be the result of anti-competitive practices or the result of a heavily market-concentrated supply chain. For a new generative model to attain the compute or cloud service infrastructure needed to keep the model running, they would need to partner with an incumbent. As such, the generative model layer has meant few new entrants besides those partnered with the largest of tech companies and the large tech companies themselves. Additionally, the model layer contains resource issues that prevent more companies from entering the market. The amount of data needed to train a model is enormous itself. Technical expertise is another cost-intensive necessary resource. The resource intensiveness of both the earlier layers of the stack and the model layer itself encourages companies to keep their model weights and architecture close to maintain profitability, especially for earlier entrants that already have footing in the market. For example, OpenAI famously kept its technical information closed when asked to reveal it in the New York Times v. Microsoft case. This stack structure and subsequent consolidation of partnerships have raised alarm for regulators. The US FTC has markedly expanded its role in regulating the tech industry in response to these emergent challenges. This shift indicates that companies do have to hold. The department has departed from such a previous strategy of saying that it only had to trigger Section 5 of the FTC Act. This shift indicates that companies do have to hold a monopoly do not have to hold a monopoly in a traditional sense. Despite this, there's also confusion about what is open source, as there's a gradation of open source for models. It's not as simple as open source for software. Several people have released different understandings of or different frameworks for open source AI that explain how you can be fully closed or fully open. However, there is something called open washing that many models have done, which is where they appeal to being open for commercial reasons, but for all intents and purposes are closed. Trade secrecy for this reason is perfect for generative AI in light of importance of secrecy around certain aspects of generative models, most notably the model weight, the model architecture. Companies seeking to maintain their competitive advantage have started to use trade secrecy to protect these model specificities. As I mentioned before, one of the first and most notorious examples is OpenAI's refusal to disclose its architecture, including model size, hardware, training compute, dataset construction, training method, or similar. Trade secrets are perfect. They not only allow for secrecy, they necessitate it. Trade secrecy more or less contains three components: that the information is secret, the secret generates economic value, and that reasonable efforts have been made to maintain the secrecy. Model components are perfect candidates for this sort of protection, as they easily fit the requirements and organizations are required to do what economically benefits them, create barriers towards transparency. Furthermore, it's also appealing for jurisdictional incentives. The fact that there's not a similar creator limitation in the way there is for copyright. So in copyright, there is, that limitation that there has to be that human form of expression for it to be copyrightable. And trade secrecy that we know of has not had that yet. And it's broad international protection. So this is all in contrast to the idea of transparency. And why I advocate for transparency. It's been pretty well established that transparency is great for representation and power. The opportunity to decide how a model gets built, especially a tool used as frequently and widely as a generative AI model, is a position of great power. Thus, more than a few companies should have the opportunity to decide how models are structured, what safety features to implement, what qualifies as misinformation, and so forth. The concern with closed models is that the economic burden to create or contribute to another generative model will be sufficient enough to prevent anyone but the largest corporations from being an active player in the creation of these models, thus severely limiting the representation in who contributes. Additionally, as a result of this, you don't get input from a diverse array of AI experts, which can also make models representative of a very narrow type of field or thinking. You also prevent civil society from effectively acting as watchdogs. Secrecy or lack of disclosure requirements has long been at odds with accountability, and in some instances, trade secrecy has been a mechanism to hide the harms of a particular technology from the public. Allowing civil society to pry into the black box is crucial for catching and addressing ethical concerns. And secrecy, ironically, can be argued to be at odds with competition and innovation. And one of the foremost reasons that secrecy is even legal is to promote competition and innovation. However, if secrecy encourages concentration of the market, then it negatively affects quality and access. Concentration in one layer of the stack, specifically the model layer, can mean decreased quality. The generative image model Stable Diffusion was trained on Getty Images, for example, with its images bearing the Getty Images watermark. Images generated bore a distorted Getty watermark have resulted in a copyright infringement lawsuit. This situation illustrates the danger of relying on one or few generative image models. Should applications get built on top of these models, or should companies integrate these models within their workflow, the error can be replicated. In other words, the figurative Getty watermark can be reproduced on a myriad of content exiting the model. In the case of a generative model trained on proprietary healthcare data, a model intended to screen for cancer may reproduce errors in catching particular genes, leading to a systemic failure with life-threatening consequences. This is just one example. Others have raised the concern of algorithmic monoculture, which describes the risks associated with, quote, the same systems or systems that share components, e.g. training data, end quote. Furthermore, harm can be perpetrated through this monoculture even in the absence of flaws in training data. In, for example, homogeneous outcomes can further entrench systemic biases and barriers to economic and social mobility. Continuing with the healthcare application-based model example, consider an example brought forth by Creel and Hellman in regards to the societal implications of data being commonly drawn from hospitals in 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York, due to funding and infrastructure capabilities around research. Again, the inevitable failure to predict accurately for the residents of alternative states is widely discussed. However, the standardization to result from such is novel. In this example, decisions across the nations would become standardized from the data secured from an unrepresentative group. From a quality perspective, generative models and their respective applications built on top of such models may suffer from an inability to diversify their product, especially if standardization becomes a multi-layer problem. Additionally, traditional monopoly concerns such as downstream access are present. Downstream access concerns include the entrenched player manipulating the prices or terms for downstream developers to favor their own applications or those with whom they are partnered with. In the partner landscape within the stack, the concern is that dominant players may limit access to one layer of the stack, such as cloud services or training data, in order to prevent another layer, such as the competing model or application, from gaining market share from either themselves or their partnered proxies. The most apparent example can be seen with platform giants restricting data scraping by web crawlers. As a FTC report explains, first, more established companies may benefit from access to data collected from their users over many years, especially if the incumbents also own digital platforms that amass large amounts of data. This data may also be more detailed and robust. Second, established companies are more likely to have developed and honed proprietary data collection tools and technologies for acquiring or scraping data. Issues with dataset access continue within the openness discussion. Larger, quote, open source models, such as Meta's Llama 2, have faced criticism for their reluctance to make their training dataset available. While Llama 2 does leave their model weight and dataset documentation open, smaller models built for research purposes are rated better across a number of standards of openness, including dataset access. So I want to note that secrecy is a multi-layer problem. Even with a model open to whatever degree previously agreed upon, its capabilities are hindered by secrecy embedded into its other layers. Furthermore, secrecy cascades with market power because of the effects of tying products, integrating products together, and a lot of the quality and access concerns that I mentioned. However, openness is and compute costs for large foundation models are so large that entities, except for the most well-funded, can afford that resource. Even after the training phase, the compute needed to deliver answers and generate images is continuous and enormous. However, openness, especially when understood within solely the model layer, should not be conflated for democratization of AI. For openness to succeed, it should be understood as a multi-layer initiative that seeks to provide infrastructural support so that newer entrants may enter the field. So current solutions to secrecy and transparency tensions include the EU AI Act and its calls for transparency. One of the notes that I made is that documentation. However, documentation is notably abstract. Some aspects of disclosure are relatively straightforward. Other disclosures invite more uncertainty. I think how it's implemented will largely decide its effectiveness. It should be noted, however, that openness in itself cannot be confused for transparency. While documentation falls short of providing meaningful oversight due to its mediated nature, a system in which all source code of a model is made available also does little to advance the objective of allowing the public to understand these models, because finding the quote relevant information has been famously compared to finding the quote proverbial needle in a haystack. The goal is to inform the public. Information overload, especially of technical details, will most likely not be understood. So while documentation in and of itself is not enough to ensure transparency, neither is full openness without documentation. Both are important, and neither alone can inform the public and allow external researchers the capability to audit and test the models. Without other options for resources earlier up in the generative AI pipeline, transparency in the model layer can be co-opted by the largest players. So global investment is another solution, especially within key infrastructure points. It can help address governance and antitrust concerns posed by the concentration of players within the generative AI pipeline. A solution could be three-pronged: investment by federal governments into their own respective AI infrastructure, regulatory carve-outs to minimize liability, and international grants to enable the Global South a seat at the transparency table. I recommend that funding and regulatory benefits remain dependent on continuous commitment to transparent ideals so that it is not co-opted once it becomes profitable. Different forms of intellectual property protections are supposed to generate different expected trade-offs. Trade secrecy is intended to offer broader protection at the expense of certainty. Copyright law is intended to grant holders greater protections and allow them to profit off of their expression in exchange for publication of their creation. However, this dichotomy is not as clear with open source. So there is oftentimes concerns about double protection, that copyright and trade secrecy will both be used. So in this situation, I suggest using ex-ante governance to adopt trade secret law and open source carve-outs to ensure that there is not this double protection that has been seen. The disruptive ideology of the technology space, while once a reality, is now a little more than a mantra. The AI technology stack is so resource heavy that access to infrastructure, hardware, cloud services, and data limits the ability of new players to truly disrupt the control maintained by today's tech barons. This resource concentration encourages the use of trade secret protection, which in turn cements higher barriers for researchers, civil society, and smaller companies from building off of such innovation and/or auditing models. Simultaneously, generative AI will affect the ability to disseminate and create trade secrets, creating further questions regarding its use in protecting generative AI models' technical information. At the heart of such tensions is the inherent pull towards the profitable, and when transparency ideals were made at odds with such, reconciliation attempts have resulted in reducing transparency to a mediation of understanding of AI's logic rather than a true look inside the black box. Openness in all its gradation poses considerable potential to encourage greater global participation and innovation, as well as to provide researchers a, quote, look inside. However, this gradation also leaves room for open washing, and so policy must be situated with the understanding of this complexity. Regulators should encourage openness from a multi-layer perspective, understanding that to provide public infrastructural support and regulations is to decrease the reliance on the closed and market concentrated. Thank you.
All right, Anna, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us in this meeting. And I feel like it might be really early for you, so I'm extra happy that you've been here. I would like to go to Berna, who has had a few questions or comments for you.
Yes, thank you, Hannah, for your presentation. I am not an expert in AI, so but I have questions, and if there's any misunderstanding on my part, please point it out. So even for a non-AI expert person like myself, I couldn't. We couldn't escape the news about this new generative AI model developed by a Chinese company, DeepSeek. From what I understand, DeepSeek caused quite a stir in the AI community, especially in the West, due to its advanced performance levels. Now, and unlike the Western high-performing AI models that remain proprietary, I can never pronounce this word, proprietary and protected by trade secrets, as we pointed out, DeepSeek has been released as an open source model. Now, this decision was unexpected and has ignited discussions about the possibility of democratizing access to AI technology through a Chinese product. And so, therefore, my first question is, regarding the DeepSeek example, what do you believe was the incentive structure for choosing openness, for choosing an open source model? Do you think public interest was considered at all? And so my second question is about high barriers to entry in the AI markets. So what do we assume? I mean, you mentioned a few about what they could be, what high these barriers could be. But then it was reported, again, I'm going back to DeepSeek, it was developed by a 200-person team in a year and a half with minimal financial investment. Do you think this example has changed the assumptions about these high barriers to entry? So these are my two questions. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for your question. I think to answer your first question, I can't speak to their incentives, but I do think creating an open model, at that level, regardless of whether it was created for the public benefits interest or not, it at least speaks to its possibility. And I think it puts pressure on closed models to do better. And I think it maybe shuts down some of the arguments that we've seen that says that, this isn't something that we can do. That being said, I think the fact that there's not more open models at that level, and that when you do go into, meetings with some of the largest tech companies, and that there is only a few, open source models that are able to survive in the US, at least, whether that's like Eleuther AI, et cetera, speaks to that it is still computationally expensive. I think some of the other things, the data, the expertise are things that are a little bit more malleable. But I don't think the computational expense is something necessarily at this stage that you can get around without infrastructure support. I also think, I think the second question was about, did that answer both of the questions?
Bhorat, could you repeat the second question that you posed?
Yes, so I thought my microphone, my audio was open. Okay, so yes, you answered both my questions, because the first question was about the incentives to be open, and then about the barriers to entering the market. And you've
yes.
Okay, thank you.
I did have one more thing I want to say. And in regards to, I think, with making sure that incentive structures are aligned, I think, it's great regardless of what country or what nation is building an open model that it is being built. But I also do think it's important that, the Global South also is being included within the creation of their own models. So there is that sort of sovereignty, or there is that sort of input and representation. Because just how American companies have later turned closed models or open models into closed models for profit reasons, the same argument could be made with DeepSeek, whether that's for profit incentives, for geopolitical incentives. We really don't know. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Jamal, please go ahead.
Thanks, Hannah, for the presentation. I wanted to ask just one point about, you mentioned about the Global South developing their own models, and you talked about global investments. There's been huge amounts of news about how public authorities are announcing massive investments in AI development in recent weeks, but all of this is coming from private funding, if I'm correct. And my question is what kind of institutional frameworks do you think could actually be setting out public financing for these kind of global investments, and how would that actually work out? Because this is currently it seems that a lot of this is being developed by the private sector, and I guess what your call for global investments is actually to look at institutional frameworks for doing that within a public remit.
Thank you. So I think the Governing AI report, which was released after I wrote this paper, actually makes a suggestion for, I don't know what they call it, but they make a suggestion and a call for a global fund. Oh yes, they call it a global fund for AI. And I think it's for some of the resources that I mentioned that are the most expensive. And I think that's a great mechanism, whether or not, that actually is able to be built, we'll see. But I think there's also been, I think the environmental cause is a great blueprint for how nation states and private partnerships have sort of collaborated on issues sort of, bigger than themselves, and found ways to funnel funds to address the issue, but in a way that also considers both multi-stakeholder and multilateral input. I think we need probably more minds to think about how to best, balance, that we're both having different stakeholder input, because I do think we should have industry expertise as we figure out how best to invest in infrastructure, while also making sure that we're having like a multilateral discussion that is involving the global south and it is involving smaller players at a nation state level. But I think it's been done before with other large pressing challenges, and I think we should look to those as examples. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, let me check the chat one more second. Sorry, Jamal, I saw you do point something. Did you raise your hand?
No, I was pointing at the chat. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I see it now.
The chat on my
Benjamin, would you like to ask your question? You could unmute yourself.
Yes, I could do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you, Anna, for your presentation. Well, I'm just considering investment here in Global South or models or infrastructure and all that. My question would be, is there a threshold that a society or a state in Global South has to reach before they start considering investment in things like AI investment or building their own model?
Like a minimum threshold before.
Probably.
Sorry?
I said probably. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think there's, there's the underlying discussion that I've seen happening, which is, shouldn't we meet, sort of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, meet other needs in some areas before we invite building like model infrastructure in some of these countries. I do think there are in some areas more important things than building out AI, especially in areas that I think are struggling meeting those basic needs. But I also think to some degree that if it's sort of an excuse for the West to not invest and to not see the global South as anything but a consumer, because I think the global South is and already has been consuming this. And if we're not considering them as not only a consumer, but like an active contributor, then we are leaving them out. I think as you invest in AI infrastructure, you're also investing in a digital public infrastructure too, as well. You can't build out an AI supply chain if you don't have access to basic internet across the country. And so I think it'll probably also bring to light some other general infrastructural issues. But I think many countries, in the G20 even, or in BRICS countries, could be great candidates for global investment, and that don't have, and that probably are already at, in my opinion, a minimum level.
All right, thank you very much, Hannah. Then if there are no other questions, I think it's time to wrap up this session of today. But before I do that, I would like to thank our discussant, Berna. Thank you very much for being here. Great job. And everyone else who is still in the chat. I would like to bring your attention to the fact that this was just day one. So we'll have another day this Thursday. It starts at 8 o'clock Central European time. And then we'll have two panels again of each 3 papers, so in total 6 papers. So I would love to see you all back then. Jamal, is there anything you would like to add?
Thank you very much to all speakers, all discussants, and our chair for today. Thanks very much, Sophie, for handling everything so well. We are, we're looking forward to joining everybody on Thursday morning, okay, where Tricia will start off with the discussants role, and I'll be up exceptionally early to connect. Okay.
All right. Well, have a good day, morning, evening, wherever you are. Hope to see you on Thursday.
Thanks to everybody.